Welcome everyone to the ESIP SOI Cluster call. Today we're going to be hearing from Kai on ontology principles, workflows, and tools specifically focused around ENVO and the OBO ontologies. Kai is an ontologist at the Biological and Chemical Oceanographic Data Management Office at Woods Hole Institute and a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona. He works on various open source ontologies to promote environmental and life science data interoperability. So I'm quite excited about your call or your presentation, and thank you for coming to talk with us. So take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'll be giving this talk again. It's a repeat of one I've given before, but I think we have a somewhat slightly different audience, and I think it's useful to repeat some of these concepts, as some of it is quite general and some of it is prescriptive as to things that could be done in the future if there's ever an endeavor to kind of lead toward a community soil ontology, or at least leverage some of the existing tools to work in that direction. Yeah, so the talk will go over some principles, tools, and workflows. I'm just kind of from an ontologist perspective who deals with other environmental or life science data harmonization efforts and ontology management and creation, projects that I'm involved in. Just some of my thoughts about what could be done for soils or what might be useful and kind of what exists in the OBO landscape. And I'll give a little more, I'll talk about what that means in a second. So first, just very generally, FAIR principles. I'm sure everyone is, sick and tired of hearing about this, but I think it bears note that you can't just, put something in some format and say, like, I've done it, it's fair. It's like the whole idea of this is to make sure that the data is not only accessible to humans, but it can be discovered by machines. That, I think, is the real take home of that paper. There's a lot of nuance and subtleties about how that would be done, but systems that allow for automated queried discovery of data so that we can have automatic machine-to-machine communication to look for concepts of interest, I think is going to be the future of, well, hopefully a lot of sciences. So we'll see. Yeah, and then this applies not only to data, but also the vocabularies. So the vocabularies and the data that they represent themselves should be, in accordance with the FAIR principles, and, machine-to-machine communicable. Okay, so in terms of just breaking down FAIR a little bit in terms of the points. So in basic things about, like the findability of a vocabulary, can the term be found or discovered? So like in a glossary on the web, do the terms have a globally unique identifier? Is there like an IRI or something along those lines that, is dereferenceable? You click on it or you send a script there, you can go find a page that has things. Are vocabulary terms defined using recommended fields? So some basic metadata that describe the vocabulary term. So, could it be minimally labeled with something like a label? RDFS is a schema for data representation on the web. So, using a predicate like that, like RDFS label or something similar, SCOS label, or preferably, some other additional annotation properties that might accompany the vocabulary term. So things like, a comment, a description, a definition from SCOS, RDF, DC, an existing set of standards or tools. And then also would the terms be hierarchically arranged? So are we just looking at flat lists of vocabulary where we have to scroll through it infinitely, or are there places where we can find data that's arranged in a hierarchical, subclass relationship, like a type in a more specific type that is a type of the broader type, using, existing standards, again, like RDFS subclass of. So this slide might be a little out of date. I'm not sure what the current status of a project like Glossus is, and I'm certainly not trying to, put anyone down or anything. I just wanted to kind of bring attention to something along the lines of like what might be a useful project, but in terms of a vocabulary, minimally findable. So, or minimally labeled. So for example, when previously I had looked at Glossus, again, maybe it's different now, but we could see that it was kind of minimally labeled. There were kind of just topic kind of keywords, but nothing really more than that in terms of a definition or other metadata about what soil might mean, or like these different data sets, et cetera. No dereferenceable HTTPS IRI, as in no like URL you can click on to just get there and see the accompanying metadata about what that vocabulary term might mean. No annotations like definitions, no hierarchical arrangement. That's kind of, for a very first stop shop, that's okay. But I think as vocabularies get more sophisticated, I think having all of those things is incredibly useful. In terms of accessibility, how accessible are the vocabularies? Are they behind a paywall? Are they open access? Are they behind a paywall? Are the terms only in hard copy? For example, in a book or a glossary, or buried in a PDF where you would have to use some sort of machine learning thing to extract them at, blah, blah, blah. Or you just have to go look at the PDF and say like, oh yeah, no, I mean this term that's on page 7 of that PDF. It's slightly different than being able to, again, dereferencably get to a term just by clicking on an IRI, and then you see it there on the web for everyone to see, rather than it just being kind of hidden in a PDF somewhere. And then do the terms kind of follow standard syntaxes and structures? So there are a variety of these tools. I don't want to get too deep into all of it, but SCOS, simple knowledge object schema, I believe, something along those lines. OWL, the Ontology web language, RDF, the resource description framework. There are others, but do they kind of follow, would this vocabulary be accessible using one of these pre-existing kind of standards or syntaxes where a parser might have an idea of how to get through it, or what to look for, et cetera. Yeah, so Simon, fantastic professor, has been involved in lots of work, but here's a great example of things that, I believe, my understanding is he's struggling with things like this, where, certain terms are like the work he's involved in, these Australian soil classifications, unless they fix the problem now, but they tend to only be, buried in some sort of book or glossary. And they may or may not yet be in a state that they are discoverable on the web. So interoperable vocabularies, what does this mean? So interoperable is kind of the trickier part of FAIR. Interoperable means working together. Do things actually work together at a machine level? So what they kind of say in the paper, that the data ought to use a formal, accessible, shared, and broadly applicable language for knowledge representation, as in this is the vocabulary used to represent data itself needs to be, conform to all of these principles, that the vocabulary follows these principles, and that this metadata itself, these vocabularies, include qualified references to other metadata. That could mean a lot of things. That could mean references between, vocabulary systems. If it's soil or sub-specific soil concepts are represented within 2 different vocabularies, it would be, and the terms are similar to one another or are mappable in some way, it would be great to have metadata that, link off to those other qualified resources, those other qualified references. So mappings, for example, would be an example of this, but there could be many more things. But the kind of important thing is that the vocabulary itself kind of be in some sort of machine accessible format that humans can look at it and browse it as well, but also machine systems can go and discover data annotated with such a thing based on the vocabulary itself, that the vocabulary itself is in some sort of formal knowledge representation system like OWL or SCOS, and that it can be discovered and used to allow for data interoperability. Yeah, and kind of there are a variety of existing patterns and standards and recommendations. There are design patterns, basically ways of coming up with vocabulary terms or the schemas thereof, and trying to reuse these things and when possible, and making things a little more automated when we create vocabularies. But I can talk a little bit more about that later. Reusability in vocabularies. Does it include more than just labels? Do they include other additional useful information, definitions, descriptions, comments, citations, mappings, etc.? Do they include links to relevant terms? Or do they include how these things are related? do they do so using a common syntax? So for example, you could use an OWL object property or relation, which is kind of a very formalized machine understood relationship between two concepts. And that comes in with a little bit more sophisticated vocabularies like ontologies. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Do terms have unambiguous, globally unique identifiers, as in IRIs that are unique to that term and will always be dereferenced on the web? Do they include linkages or mappings to other applicable vocabularies? All of these things kind of help with the reusability of the vocabulary. So back to that idea of the ontology versus kind of just a simpler controlled vocabulary or something a little simpler. So there's a variety of different forms that semantic systems could exist in. So semantics is just words. Don't be afraid. There's a lot of terminology here, but we're just talking about vocabularies or systems to represent vocabularies or words. And there's different ways that these things can exist, and they kind of exist along roughly a gradient. Some people call it the semantic gradient, but basically the idea being how strongly do these different types of semantic systems capture relevant information at a machine level or along various things like along a machine. How do we capture various information in a way that makes it more fair or more strong or more developed? So simpler things like controlled vocabularies might just have a list of terms, within an Excel sheet. And, you could have a list of terms and then their definitions, and that could be an Excel sheet controlled vocabulary. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It just, that's the limit of it. There's nothing, more sophisticated. Or taxonomy, for example, might, additionally have a hierarchical system. So usually taxonomies do. So, if your controlled vocabulary also had a hierarchical structure to it, like ocean is a type of water body, for example, or, wetland is a type of ecosystem, et cetera, then you could say that there's a taxonomic structure to that vocabulary. And then finally, ontologies kind of build up a bit on that further, that they not only have the taxonomic structure, but they can also have lateral relations and other types of information that are encoded that themselves become machine searchable properties that can be discovered and represent more concepts. So what I mean specifically by that is in your ontology, which is a human and machine readable logical representation of knowledge about real world entities, you could not only have hierarchical relationships, so you have a concept with its subconcepts, but you could also have lateral relationships, so concepts that have other relationships to other concepts. So a bicycle has part wheel, that sort of thing. Okay, so zooming in a little bit on people and projects that develop ontologies at scale, I'm going to talk specifically about OBO Foundry, the Open Biological and Biomedical Ontology Foundry and Library. You can just refer to this as OBO. So the long and short is that OBO is a collection of many, many different domain-specific ontologies that are designed to work interoperably with one another by following common design principles. There's certainly a lot of room for improvement, but it's better than any large-scale system. It's the only large-scale system of various people cooperating across disciplines that I'm familiar with, hence why I spend so much time engaging with this community and trying to make it better. There are, of course, many other ontologies that exist. There's some other good examples too, but I really want to focus on this, and I'll talk a little bit more about potential options for soil ontologies, but I want to talk about it specifically in the context of what the OBO Foundry has to offer in terms of building out vocabularies and making them interoperable with other existing ontologies. So just some small examples here on the slide of relevant OBO ontologies, or somewhat relevant anyway, just an example, a teaser of what exists within OBO. There's the environment ontology, which I'll talk more about in this talk, which represents different types of environments, habitats, has some information about soils, but of course it could be expanded. Other various ontologies like for phenotypes and traits or environmental qualities, for example, in Pato. There's the relations ontology, which is a controlled set of relations which help to formalize the structures used in those lateral relationships, the has part bicycle, has part wheel, that kind of thing that I showed earlier. There's within OBO a set of core relations that we always reuse so that we can make machine-to-machine communication more standardized and make it easier for people to write out these ontologies so they're not just doing things ad hoc their own way. We're kind of trying to standardize on certain principles. Using standard relations would be one of them. The gene ontology, for example, is very famous within the life sciences. It helped to unify biology from a bunch of different organisms. So, if a gene was called something in mice and it was called something different in flies, the gene ontology really helped to harmonize that information. Similarly, the chemical entities of biological interest is kind of a combination of various databases about basically chemicals, but it's now represented within an ontology format, and it has its hierarchical structure, and it's very useful. Lots of people contribute to it. And there's others, for example, the ontology for biomedical investigations, which kind of helps to formalize the process of conducting investigations. It's more of a biomedical focus, but the principles could apply to environmental systems as well. So a little bit more about the environment ontology. So it's a community representation of environments. So there are a lot of domains represented within ENVO. For example, microbial ecology, oceanography, cryospheric sciences. There's been a large push for that within the ESIP Semantic Harmonization Cluster. Other concepts like hazards and pollution, some soil science concepts. It's supported in several use cases, so notably within genomics. It's used within the MIXS standards, which is kind of an example of a community standard. I know someone had mentioned, trying to leverage existing community standards. I'm not sure, what they all are in soil, but within genomics, which includes soil genomics, there is a very big use of the MIXS standards, the minimum information about any X sequence, data to kind of provide some metadata context for information about a genomic sequence that was collected, for example, a soil metagenome. And so this is pretty widely used within genomic data and within various repositories that kind of use or draw upon genomic data. The National Microbiome Data Collaborative, to name a recent example, but there are many more. So it kind of really helps, ENVO is really helping to standardize the vocabulary that's used to describe the environmental context of samples via the MIXS standards. So that makes it a very powerful use case for people. And you can see here just kind of a little graph. It's really hard to see what all is in there. ENVO has thousands of terms, so I just wanted to kind of, make a cute little graphic about, some things you might find in ENVO in terms of the environmental material hierarchy, things like sand or resin, sea foam, etc. There's quite a few concepts that are represented within it. So ENVO as a fair vocabulary, just to kind of hit back on those points I was talking about earlier in the introduction, to show what I mean by, like here's an example of ENVO as a fair vocabulary, which is one of the OBO ontology vocabularies. So OBO ontologies as fair vocabularies. You can see a variety of things here. So there's the term label, but the term IRI is a dereferenceable HTTPS IRI, which will always resolve, and it can always be found by people. When you point your data system at this, you say like, no, I mean this PULSA, like that's exactly what I mean. Here's a place on the web that signifies exactly what I mean by PULSA or whatever the concept is. There's a definition which is annotated with a definition. IAO is another ontology, but it's a definition property that is standardized. We're using a standardized syntax for the declaration that this thing is a definition. So if you had an automated script that was searching for definitions from these terms, you would know where to look in the file, basically. It has other things, like exact synonym, so other metadata, which again has an OWL annotation property, or it's related to OWL, but it has an annotation property that says, these things are exact synonyms, like a pulse log, etc. RDFS comments, has some comments about it. So that's all stuff that, you might find in a web controlled vocabulary, but what makes an ontology slightly different is kind of the lateral or hierarchical relationships that you'll find. So for example, on here, you'll see the hierarchical relationships. So it exists within a hierarchy. So you can see that pulsa is a type of frost heave, which is a type of elevation, which is a type of solid astronomical body part, etc. And this is all denoted using the RDFS subclass relationship. So this makes it a machine searchable kind of graph that you can look through to discover subclasses that might be relevant to your question of interest. It also has machine readable axioms, which are linkages between concepts. And so, for example, the pulsa, we've encoded some of these relationships, such as like has part some ice lens and is surrounded by some soil or permafrost. Or maybe a simpler one, part of some wetland ecosystem and has part some permafrost. So here's how we can kind of make these machine readable linkages between concepts that are encoded within the vocabulary itself that are discoverable at a machine level. There's lots of work needed to be done to kind of standardize these things so they can actually be queried in a useful way, but following design patterns and kind of, keeping what's important in mind, it is possible to encode these things, which kind of help to bring ontologies to the next level in terms of knowledge representation. You can allow people to ask questions like, I'm interested in anything, any type of, ecosystem that might be adjacent to permafrost or something along those lines. And you could discover terms like pulsa that way in a machine system. Yeah, thanks, Mark Schildhauer, for this slide. So a bit more about ENVO soil related content. It's not, of course, there's room for more. There are plenty of terms, but of course, there's plenty of things missing as well. So just kind of starting at the top, the ENVO soil hierarchy, you can see here's how ENVO is representing soil at a high level. It has many, many subtypes. So you can see just in this graph is just a lot of different subtypes of soil, and that it itself is an environmental material, has kind of a broad ranging definition, but specific enough as well, cross-referenced to, where parts of that definition came from, comments as well. And then of course it has machine readable linkages. So, we're asserting that soil, and perhaps someone in this cluster could, tell us if this is wrong, but we're kind of asserting to the machine at a machine level that soil has part some clay. So anything that doesn't have clay can't be a soil. So maybe that's wrong. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not the soil expert here, but that's the kind of machine linkage that we're expressing here. So that's kind of one other thing that ontologies can do for you is, you say all the conditions that are required to make something what they are, etc. So a little more soil related content. So we have, terms that might be measured quantities within soil. So things like particulate organic carbon, particulate organic nitrogen, etc. There's a lot more work that could be done here, but this is just kind of an example of, terminology that might be relevant to people here. And yes, it links back to terms from other ontologies. So in this example, particulate organic carbon, we're saying that it's particulate organic matter that's composed primarily of some carbon group molecular entity, and that links off to KEBI, which itself is its own hierarchy. And there's a whole bunch of different concepts or terminology represented within KEBI, and we're saying at this level in the KEBI node, it's composed something of that. So anything in that list could be, part of this particulate organic carbon. So other examples. So here we're kind of making use of basic design patterns where we say like the mass density of soil or the conductivity of soil, et cetera. And there's kind of systems for helping to automate terms that follow nice design patterns like that. But here you can see mass density of soil, it's mass density and it's inhering in some soil. This could be something more specific. So it could be mass density of, mass density of like a more specific soil subtype. So mass density of, for example, like sandy soil, or I'm not the expert in soil, so I'm not going to come up with a better example. But it could be, these kinds of things can be used to create compositional terms, which could get proliferated out if there are a variety of terms that need to be created. And then, of course, this makes use of an OWL equivalence axiom, which allows for inference and reasoning, which I can talk more about if people are interested, but basically automated hierarchical placement of terms, which is pretty cool. That's one of the things that OWL can help us do. OWL, the ontology web language, which ontologies are typically encoded within. Yeah, and so like I said, there's kind of some tools to help automate the creation of things like this once a certain design pattern is arrived at. So we can, create these things via just kind of templates. So there's like a CSV, TSV template where, we say like, okay, we're interested in a variety of, characteristics of environmental materials. So we're going to, say like, here's the temperature of air, here's the porosity of soil, here's the mass density of soil, et cetera. And we can, go ahead and create a lot of these things and use reasoning to help generate the hierarchical positioning of them within the ontology. Reasoning being kind of like first order logic. So anyway, I don't want to go too deep into that, but there's ways to kind of help automate some of this work. There's more of these things that kind of help with that. So we can, a variety of tools. I don't want to get too deep. Well, maybe I'll discuss this briefly and then, switch back to questions, but I just kind of the last slides, I want to just mention that there are a variety of different ways that we can help to generate ontology classes using tools that might be a little simpler than using just Protege itself. There are things called robot templates, which kind of help to create ontology classes from CSV files. Same with another tool, the DOSDP. The DOSDP is kind of what was shown here, that kind of helps to create things that can allow for reasoning, et cetera. So it kind of allows us to go from a tabular format into a more machine expressive format that, to kind of help auto-generate some of this code, which is more comprehensible and searchable to computers. And, making use of various ontologies within these, machine expressible axioms. Yeah, so that's just a little bit about that stuff. There are some examples of workflows. So within ENVO, we kind of created this template and merge workflow, which kind of helps to, create it. We have a group working system where, we pioneered this in the ESIP semantic harmonization cluster, where we would have, basically a big CSV or TSV file where people are, adding their vocabularies into the ontology, and we can go through it together and make sure that the appropriate columns in the template are filled out, and then in the end, the whole thing gets compiled down into the ontology code. So it's kind of like a guide / process for non-ontologists to contribute vocabulary terms to an ontology, and if they want to express them at kind of a deeper level, or whatever level of granularity they want to express their terms in. So, okay, so all that being said, I can talk more about that later. That was very high level, but I don't want to go too over time. So just some basic ideas or possibilities for the soil informatic cluster. So you can always build a new ontology or vocabulary from scratch. If you completely go from scratch, you just ignore everything else that exists in the universe. It's harder to reuse existing tools. You need your own URL server. There's workarounds, but there are workarounds, so that might not be the biggest problem. But the more important problem is it might be harder to make it interoperable with other existing systems. And you would need to do the extra work of making the mappings to make sure that you're interoperable with other existing systems if you were to build something new from scratch. Otherwise, it's kind of just going to be siloed, which, I mean, on the flip side, it can be quicker, it can be done quicker. You don't have to wait for people, you don't have to follow existing patterns. So yeah, you can move a lot faster, but in the end of the day, what you have might not be fair or as useful as you need it to be, depending. Another possibility would be to work into an existing knowledge/tooling ecosystem like OBO. I talked about OBO a lot, so I think I've probably made some good cases for why that might be useful, but there's other ones that exist. For example, Suite. I wouldn't say that it's quite as developed. It has, maybe a few people working on it relative to OBO, which has probably thousands of people working on it, but on the various projects within it. But, there are other systems that exist, and, it is possible to try and work into some of those as well. For example, the NERC vocabulary server within the UK is a really good system for oceanographic vocabularies, and it's different than OBO. And, if you're a marine system or cluster, it might make some sense to kind of, integrate within their system. I'm not sure if something comparable to the NERC vocabulary for marine exists within soil, though. It's not my area of expertise. But if you work within existing tooling systems, it helps to foster the FAIR principles, especially interoperability. And that also allows you kind of the access to the tooling and the community expertise that, you would find with something like OBO. So if you were to, if there was a push for a soil informatics cluster, one place it could start is to communicate or contribute directly within ENVO. We'd be happy to host that, although, it's limited bandwidth. It is still an open source project. Another option would be to create a new OBO soil ontology. We'd have to discuss this with people within the OBO and ENVO community, but I think that would be, I think there would be acceptance of that. I think that's totally reasonable, in my humble opinion. So that could be another avenue. And this has been done before, just to put this in context. So originally, there were a lot of food terms being requested to ENVO, and we realized that's a whole different domain. OBO ontology should be domain, specific. They shouldn't cover too much. So what ended up happening basically was someone took on the project, and the food ontology was born, food on, and it categorizes the handling of food products, and all that stuff got moved out of ENVO and put into food on. Agro, the agronomy ontology, similar thing happened there. And then more recently, I helped in this effort to kind of but to kind of create a new ontology, kind of spun off a little bit from food on, for the compositional dietary nutrition ontology, which has to do with information pertaining to human diets. So because that information is similar to foods, but it's different, and it merited its own ontology, but it was still kind of based on some of the information that was in food on and made to be interoperable with food on, so that people could use it in useful ways to categorize their data, like the USDA labels, etc. Anyway, so there's precedent for these sorts of things, is my point here. And there's a lot of tools for creating OBO compliant ontologies. There's a starter kit for this. I won't go too much into it here, but basically there's a tool that allows one to fairly simply create a new ontology that's already formatted for OBO. It has all the files and tools and tooling kind of just built in. So you just kind of run the system, tell it what ontologies you want to import, and out comes your new ontology. Yeah, so I think we're probably pretty close to time, so I don't want to spend too much time more. So I'll just kind of skip these last slides, and we can go to questions.
So at this point, I guess we'll take clarifying questions, and then end the recording and move into more of a free-form discussion. So I will kick off clarifying questions with, I noticed that a lot of the soil terms that are popped up here on this graph are very location based. So things like farm soil or muddy soil or greenhouse soil. So these are not terms that, as a soil scientist, I would generally think of as sort of categorical or hierarchical. And so I guess I was curious as to how those were, if you knew what the motivation for incorporating those terminologies was, and why they were proposed in that way, because it seems quite odd from a soil scientist perspective, naively.
Yeah, fair enough. So let's have a look at what's actually.
Please share that link. The
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you put it in the chat?
Yeah, sure.
Then the more
Yeah,
distracted of us could look
So
at that.
bare soil, bulk soil, are sort of on the same level here from a hierarchical perspective, and it seems quite odd, I guess.
Well, okay, fair enough. I mean, these were, so I think the original use case for this was most likely the mix-S genomic data. So, we might have had a metagenome which came from, some sort of chalk soil or clay soil. And that's why, people requested that term. I mean, like I said, it has what it has. It's by no means exhaustive. I mean, I know it has some of these, kind of things that are more specific scientific terms. As for them being at that same level, it's just anything that we haven't differentiated it further other than what the differentia has been that it's soil and something else. So it's soil, which is, also acidic, soil, which is, let's just click on one of these and just see. So
Enriched is fun.
sorry?
Enriched soil is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of
Somebody had a project there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was probably coming from someone's, project where, they had done some treatments and not treatments with their soil. I'm assuming that's probably why that request was made, but I don't know. I wasn't involved in that project. But we tried our best to, and this has been a long time coming. There's been a lot of people who contributed this over the years. So we're doing our best to, include information like this as it's available, but by no means it's exhaustive. I don't know if that answers the question or helps.
A logical question here. I mean, these are now types of soil itself. I mentioned at the onset of this call that I'm looking for where to host a pile of code lists. And what I'm sitting on in that regard is I did some modeling for some aspect of GLOSSes a few years ago, trying to get sort of how do we really encode the profile data. There we went through the FAO guidelines on soil description, which is a great source of these PDF encoded code lists. And as the rest of the data model was in UML, I managed to extract these 85 code lists. Some of them are hierarchical. They all describe various characteristics of the soil. Where would that fit here?
Well, so so that's a good question. So in terms of kind of creating new terms from, things extracted from PDFs or code lists that have been turned into, tabular data, there are ways to kind of help bring this into an ontology format. So one of these tools, the robot template tool, is just kind of a way to help do this more efficiently and more in a more automated sense. But basically, one can, create an ontology from a tabular list like this. Doesn't always have to have, some fancy logical axiom. Sometimes just the subclass is enough, to say like this specific type of soil is, or, whatever this physiochemical parameter is of type this other one. And so basically what we kind of worked on in the ENVO, within the ENVO project, within the context of the semantic harmonization cluster, is we kind of created this workflow that would help to bring in some of the sea and snow ice data types or the vocabulary types into a format like this, which allow for, kind of community participation in the creation of a vocabulary. So if you, for example, had, your list of codes, I mean, maybe that's something that needs to be mapped out to other ontology terms, but if you actually wanted to go through the process of making your lists of vocabularies where you actually, define, you went in and specifically defined, when I say this term, I mean this, and here's the label that's usually used for it. This other term is a subset of, or as a subtype of that, here's the label for that. And then the first term has this code, the second term maps out to that code. That can all be implemented kind of using these tools and terminology. But it's really important to note that a lot of the work is kind of the ontologization itself, which is, saying like this concept, where does it fit within the hierarchy? It's of this type, and what differentiates it from its parent. So that's kind of the part of building the ontology itself. And then there's the part of, once you've kind of gotten these code lists and vocabularies, or once you've kind of built out the vocabulary itself, then you can link that back to the code lists, put links to properties such as the code, if there's something if it's from an existing vocabulary and there's some specific code that may or may not have a place on the web, putting it as a reference within the ontology would be a way to kind of help that happen. So I'll just like briefly show what we did with the crop ontology. We did that with USDA codes. So within our concentration terms, right? So there's like, InFoods is, I believe, a European system, and USDA has their own systems. But anyway, you can see within, just find an example. So within the compositional dietary nutrition ontology, sorry, I'm not sure if this example has a, I'll try to find an example that has, here we go. So here we put database cross-references out to the InFoods or USDA terms. So now at least, although InFoods CatTech that code does not have a place on the web, it exists, it only exists within some PDF that's, created by or whatever vocabulary the InFoods consortium has created. Now we've made a place on the web where we say, like, at least you don't have to adopt this InFoods, but now that code is represented, by this IRI. And so if you go there, that's a place to represent that concept on the web. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I'm doing my best here.
That's a nice way of actually nailing down that when we do expose it, to always reference back to that term in the PDF. I mean, that would be within the documentation anyway. My work, I'm trying to remember what these code lists were. It was several years ago. I mean, I remember some of them where the size of the fragments on the soil surface. Where, I mean, I think my questions are too complex.
So to cover one more question before we stop the recording and transition to an open discussion, Suzanne, you had a point about Pulsa that you dropped into the chat. Do you want to elaborate on it at all?
Yeah, so I just I love that you use that example, because it's one of the habitats that we're looking at in the Emerge project is something that we call a pulsa, but and looking at that description, a frost heave, which is formed as a result of a perennial ice lens forming under soil, pushing a roughly oval portion of the land surface upwards. I don't know if what we're calling a pulsar would fall under that, and there might be a better term for it. I don't know, but the sort of broader point is that there's these ENVO terms which are not always the same of what research groups have been using internally, and so I could imagine just saying, when we say pulsar, we mean this other ENVO term. But it seems like there's still some source of confusion there. And but that, on the other hand, we've been using the term pulsar for, this project has been going on in some form for over a decade now, and I doubt that everyone's going to want to change it at this point. So then I saw someone else put in the chat, oh yeah, Kathy said, but if you have the concepts disaggregated to the extent being shown, then you can automatically figure out parallel concepts and see if they both point to the same other concepts. And so I guess that would be like attaching a more accurate term from ENVO to it. But I guess, does anyone have any other ideas to avoid that kind of confusion?
So I think that actually hits on something that is both a feature and a bug of ontology work, is that I think there's some discussion in the scientific community about what exactly these terms mean. Mineral bound organic carbon comes to mind, like thinking about the measurement to disaggregate what the mineral bound organic carbon content of a particular sample is. It's controversial. There are a couple of different proposed pipelines out there that are not all directly comparable. And sort of you can come at that from both sort of a measurement angle pointing to the same vocabulary and a vocabulary angle pointing to maybe the same measurement. So the framing of that might be slightly different. So Kai, is there a way to resolve that? Blizzard.
Yeah, so here's an example of something like that we came up with. We came across during the INSD, or sorry, during the snow and ice work with Ruth Dewar. So you can see for blizzards, not everyone has the same definition of what a blizzard is. So the NSIDC, the National Snow and Ice Data Center, has one definition. The World Meteorological Organization has another definition. And then there's a concept called winter blizzard, which is a subtype of blizzard. So, if we look at these, one by one, you can see here we made the specific subtype of blizzard, which is the NSIDC blizzard, and their definition of blizzard is like it has winds that are 35 miles per hour, lasts for 3 hours, etc., occurs in extremely cold temperatures, blah blah blah. Versus the WMO blizzard, lasts at least 3 hours, combines below freezing, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is, maybe it isn't the best example in the universe, but it shows that different concepts that different people define differently can all be put into the ontology in parallel. We're not prioritizing one over the other. We're simply saying that different people have different conceptualizations of what a blizzard might mean. We all might agree at the high level what a blizzard means, but subtypes of it might be differentiated by different classes, which could be added to the ontology.
Okay, so on that note, I am going to say thank you so much, Kai, for a fantastic presentation. This sort of did a really great job of clarifying sort of what the key concepts are around fair ontologies and sort of how ENVO and OBO more broadly align with that. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording.